All right. So today's question is from Ekaterina Howard. She asked which skills in our experience are the most valuable for a B2B SaaS copywriter. So I came up with a list along with Andrew. I think we've got like 9 or 10 different items that we'll go through. So these are all things that at least I think a B2B SaaS copywriter should be able to do, especially if you want to be able to charge top rates and get hired by some of the top brands out there. Number one for me, I just kind of listed this as one category, table stakes. So these are the things that I think you absolutely have to have, whereas the others you can have, various levels of familiarity. So for me, table stakes is actually being able to write copy. I'm sure we both have experience of people emailing us wanting to do some work for us as a subcontractor. We ask them for some examples of their work, and it's clear that they haven't even figured out how to write yet. And so I just don't think you're going to have much luck if you can't string together some good sentences that are persuasive. And for me, the other one, and Andrew, you brought this one up, was psychology. I don't think you have to go to school for psychology. You don't need to be a psych major, but you absolutely need to pick up on what drives human beings, how they make decisions, what motivates them, and so on. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. I mean, I think you said, were you a psychology major or
Yeah, I
you
did
studied?
psych
Yeah,
and
me too.
physiology, so I was all about the human.
Nice. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was a psych major too, but I totally agree. It's not something that you need to know really well, but like another thing just on top of what you said, like just sort of understanding all the different biases that are always at play. I think anyone who's been doing copy for a little while understands, or sales, that we are not completely rational beings. And so we have all of these heuristics and biases that help us make decisions or sometimes help us make the wrong decision. And as people who are trying to influence behavior, we need to be aware of what some of those most powerful ones are, and even the more subtle ones too.
Yeah. I don't know if this is the case for you, but I remember when I was actually in university studying psychology, I could list out like all of the biases and give you the definitions. Whereas now I feel like it's more of a feeling. Like the biases like inform my writing. I can spot them, but I can't necessarily name them. Is that the same for you as the years have gone by?
Yeah, I think so. And I also get to a point where I almost like stop explaining them to my clients of like, okay, so one that comes to mind, and I do know the name, but like one is called like temporal discounting, where you're basically like the longer you have to wait for a reward, the less valuable you see it as. So, if I told you
Hmm.
like, hey, Josh, I'm going to send you, $100 today, you're gonna be really excited. If I tell you I'm going to send you $100 in 3 years, you're just not going to feel as excited. And so, yeah, sure, I know the name of that one, but I'm not thinking like, okay, I need to exploit or consider temporal discounting right now. I'm just thinking like, okay, how can I, we're getting close to the end of the page. How can I show them how close they are to getting this value? So
Yeah,
again, these are, yeah, I fully agree. It's things that get baked into your knowledge. It just becomes part of your knowledge. It becomes second nature when you're writing copy. Yeah, I'm definitely not thinking through that, like the list of all of the different what was the book that's like super famous, thinking in fast and slow with
yeah,
Kahneman.
yep.
And yeah, so like you don't have to read that whole book, but it might be a good idea to like go check out a YouTube summary of it and just like understand all of these little bugs in our operating systems. And just another book that we talked about before was Influence, Cialdini's
Hmm.
Influence. It's a really famous book for marketers and salespeople. Again, just like helping you understand what influences decision making, how do people make choices.
For sure. Yeah, and that'll help you spot some of those like dead sentences and paragraphs where it's like I feel like this can be working a little bit harder, and that's where you bring in some of these biases, but obviously not by name, just by feel, as unsatisfying as it is to say that, but that's the way it is. Number two on the list, absolutely nothing to do with writing copy, but I think it belongs right up at the top, and that's business acumen. So sales, knowing how to manage clients, industry knowledge. For me, for sales, it's about that first contact, the email that you have, actually knowing how to respond to that in such a way that is professional and makes it seem like you've done this before. It's that first call and being comfortable on that call, turning on your camera and being able to talk about what it is you do, and actually being able to talk about things like money and timelines and expectations, and not having to wait until the call is over so that you can write it and hide behind your email, which is obviously something that copywriters love to do. And I've been guilty of it myself as well. And it's the ability to negotiate. So it's very popular on on places like Twitter and LinkedIn to be like, name your price and that's the price and you can't waver from that price. And if you do, you're weak and you're giving up power. But there are ways to negotiate where you're not giving up power. And so that's things like making concessions. So if they do need to bring the price down, there might be options to do so where you are doing less work or you're getting some other sort of compensation. So that could be, knocking items off the scope. I've done it. I don't know if you've ever done this, but when I'm working with like a startup, especially where they're a little bit tight on budget and maybe they can pay me like 80% of what I would typically charge, and I see it as an interesting tool, I'll say, well, pay me the 80%, what you've got budgeted for this, but then I also want lifetime access to your highest tiered plan on your product. And that's worked out well for me as well. I see that as a form of compensation. In some cases, that's equal to hundreds of dollars a month that I don't have to pay as a business expense. So there are ways to sell and to negotiate that don't mean giving up any power. Client management. I think you had some thoughts on this.
Before we do client management, can I actually touch on sales? So something that we've talked about in the past before too is like so many people get into this business because they're a little bit introverted and the idea of sales is really scary to them. And it certainly was to me in the beginning as well. And I think that there's this, I think it's common for people to assume that like they know what sales is and what it looks like, and that it's this kind of like gross, situation where you're pitching and pressuring and pushing. And it's really not like that when you're selling copy. When you're selling copywriting, it's what you could call like a consultative sale. And it's me getting on a conversation with one or more people. I'm just getting on a Zoom call like this. And, I'm asking them some questions about their business, what they're hoping to accomplish. I'll share a very high overview of what my process is at first. It's not what I pictured in my head. If you'd asked me before, 5-6 years ago, what that was going to look like, I probably would have pictured like, all of these PowerPoint decks and like, going through and like getting, like thinking like
charismatic and upbeat all the time.
Like ABC, always be closing. And like, none of that is really necessary for the kind of work that we're doing. The skill itself and what it looks like might be very different from what you're picturing, and it might be a lot more human, and you might be a lot better at it, especially over time once you get more comfortable with it than you think.
Actually, in my opinion, I think being an introvert is a benefit when it comes to sales, because I think it's disarming, especially for people in our little corner of the world, like B2B SaaS. You're often dealing with someone who's technical. And as we both know, when you're talking to technical people, as soon as you have all that gloss and that charisma, like they are skeptical. They're like, what are you trying to convince me of, right? Whereas if you're just a genuine person who's having a one-to-one conversation, you're happy for it to go in such a way where you don't end up being the vendor for this project. I think that builds like a lot of trust. And that actually reminds me of going way back in university. One of my jobs there was recording and editing videos for like distance ed. So we had like this whole studio with tons of video equipment. And this guy came in and he was just having a chat with my boss, and he left, and I asked who that guy was, and he's like, oh, that's our sales rep. I'm like, oh. He's like, yeah, we just bought $20,000 worth of camera equipment. I was like, wow. And he's just like, he's the most like introverted, just nice, like easy to be around guy, was not pitching anything. And to me, that's kind of like the model of what a good salesperson is. So yeah, you do not have to be that Hollywood version of sales, at least in our space. And I think it's actually good to not be that.
100% agreed. Yep.
Client management. Any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts about client management.
Don't spoil it because I think I think each one of these can probably be like an entire
I
recording, but
know, that's what I'm realizing, because they're just
any high level
sales.
points? Yeah.
Sales, like, could do hours on that alone.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, client management. So, when they're buying a project from you, the copy is maybe half the equation. I'm just making that up. I don't know what percentage they're, paying for really, but they're paying for more than just the copy. They're paying for the whole experience of working with you.
Mhm.
And the more complicated the project is, the more ways there are that it can go wrong, that it can get stuck. I can't tell you how many projects I've seen where things were going really well, and sometime later on, like even after I'm done with the project, something goes wrong, and the project never sees the copy that I wrote never even ends up seeing the light of day. It happens. It happens. So learning how to manage that project and get the best work done possible within the time frame that you've allotted for that project is huge. So that's project management, which I'm considering as sort of a subset of client management. How to set expectations and boundaries early on. Those are things that can be really hard and scary in the beginning, because you feel like they're doing you a favor by letting you work for them almost.
Yeah.
But over time, you realize that actually you're doing them a huge benefit when you tell them what to expect and what boundaries there are, because then they don't have to wonder about it. They just, they have it in front of them. They know, when, how long is it going to take if they email you? How long can they expect before getting a response? They should know that, and they shouldn't have to ask you. You should have already told them before the project started. Or very early on in the project. And again, like, these are things that took years for me to get to this point, but and so every time you get a little bit better at it. I've started being better about like doing a postmortem after projects just on my own of, what went wrong, what could have, or, not necessarily wrong, but like, what could I improve for next time? And that's a huge tool. So every time you're making little improvements, something's going to bother you in that project, or something got stuck, you're going to figure out how to fix it next time if you take time to reflect during and after projects. How to handle difficult situations. You have to learn those kind of on the fly. Helps if you have like, for me, having coaches or a community has been really helpful for that, because it's really easy to get in your head. And I'm the kind of person who, if something gets sticky with a client, I can walk around all day just like thinking
Just
about
stewing.
it, worrying about it, stewing, having conversations in my head about, but I did this and they did that. So I think having that community and that support is really helpful there. How to present your copy and sell your copy. If you just send over a Google Doc, we've talked about this before, you just send over a Google Doc, like, boy, you're asking for trouble. Like, you are going to get feedback that you don't want, or like, but if you learn how to present it, you will get less feedback, or less unhelpful feedback, and more helpful feedback. So overall, client management, million sub skills within that. But again, like, once you have the copy and the sales skills down, I think client management is really the next thing to master.
Yeah. So that's definitely, like, we can have a whole hour on this. The one thing that I've learned that I'll add is a little policy, which is I will argue for my point one time. And then if they continue to push back on that, I will go along with the client and let them know that I disagree, but we'll move forward. And that's saved me a world of trouble, because what I think a lot of early freelancers do is they have a disagreement with the client and they're like, I'm the expert. And so they just go toe to toe with them, and that ruins the entire relationship. Whereas at the end of the day, we are selling services. And so it's our job to like advise the client and do the absolute best work in our opinion. But at the end of the day, if the client has a different idea, and they push back against you and they don't kind of take a step back and respect your expertise, it's best to just listen to the client and move forward, and just let them know that they haven't changed your mind if they haven't, but also be willing to change your mind, because I have had it where a client says something that I didn't know before, and it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. You are right. So we will go that way. But otherwise, yeah, just move forward, let them know that you disagree on this, so that if it goes poorly, it's not on you.
Yeah, 100%.
Last piece of business acumen, industry knowledge. I don't know if there's anything you want to talk about on this. I think we both came to our businesses with some of this, and that's a huge advantage for us.
Yeah, I think again, like, could make a whole video on just that idea. But one thing that I think is important is learn how to speak your client's language or your prospect's language. So we work in SaaS, people talk about things like MRR and ARR, and, you should know what a conversion rate is and what's churn, all of those things. So being able to sort of speak the language, to speak their language is just as important in copy as it is in the business of copy, of selling your copy services.
Definitely. And it's kind of like writing copy for your clients. Like part of that is knowing their pain points, their challenges, and the words they use to describe those. And when you are actually able to kind of repeat that back to your client, they see you as like a partner, someone who lives in their space, understands their struggles, and then they can trust you when you say that you have a solution. So number 3 for me was, I guess you could call this like reps or being able to spot patterns. And this idea comes from David Baker. So David C. Baker, I believe. DavidCBaker.com is his website, and he's got a couple of books, another one on the way, I believe. And this is just the idea, and you can't learn this in a book or a course, which is why I think it is so valuable. And it's just what you get when you have solved similar problems for a similar type of client over and over and over again. So what happens is a client comes to you, they think this is like a unique problem, and they're kind of panicked because they have no idea how to solve it. And then you, because you've actually seen this problem like 25 times before and you've solved it and you have proof that you've solved it with case studies and whatnot, you're able to kind of talk them off the ledge and kind of tell them like, relax. I've seen this before. I know exactly how to solve this. This is what we're going to do. This is how much it costs. This is how long it will take. Here's proof that I've done this before for companies just like yours. And obviously, this helps you land the project. It shortens the sales cycle. It allows you to ask for a higher price compared to someone who the client feels like, they're kind of guessing at how they're going to fix this. They don't have much proof that they've actually fixed this before. And so, yeah, I think this is super valuable, but I don't think you can teach it. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, not really. It sounds like it's just a function of experience and a certain amount of self-reflection, or looking at, not necessarily self-reflection, but having experience and then making an effort to learn from that experience. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just experience and wisdom that you just build over time, because that definitely happens, where you just start to see things and you go, okay, I know where that road leads. So let's go this way.
Exactly. Yeah. So definitely that experience. And then I would say like a multiplier of this, what speeds it up is focus. So if you only work with one type of client, you're going to get the necessary number of repetitions to spot those patterns way quicker, which is something that David Baker often talks about when he says like, this is why you should be specializing. A generalist who works with 20 different industries is going to take a long time to spot those problems if they ever do.
Yep.
Customer and competitor research, I think, is super important from my experience. So I've always done some amount of customer competitor research, but I used to just quote like a per page price for a client, and then I would kind of bake like a little bit of customer research into that. And sorry, I lost my train of thought there. What was I just talking about?
Well, you're talking about
customer research. Yeah.
Started separating it. Yeah.
Yeah. Beforehand. So beforehand, customer research, I baked it in, did a little bit of it. And then I had this epiphany. I was like, wow, this is probably pretty valuable. There's probably companies that do just this. And so I started to scope it out as its own separate project. And this is beneficial in a couple of ways. For one, the client gets something that they can use long after you're done working with them. They'll understand their customer and their competitors much more deeply than they otherwise would have, and they'll have documents to pull from. 2, you're probably going to spot opportunities to expand the scope in a way that isn't self-serving. So, they might come to you and say, hey, we need these 3 home pages or these 3 main pages. And you might be like, okay, I'm going to start with this research project. And then you find, yeah, you do need those 3 pages, but you would also benefit from these other 5 pages. And here's why, pointing to the research. And then all of a sudden you've, more than doubled the scope of the project, and you're delivering more value, which is super important and obviously financially beneficial as well. I guess something that comes top of mind for me for a resource for anyone who's thinking like this sounds like a ton of work, I would point to Jen Havice's book, Finding the Right Message. And in there, she's talking about how to survey customers, how to interview customers, how to organize, what is, a ton of voice of customer data, which is really messy and tedious to go through.
Oh, yeah.
And so being able to organize that and then break it down into different formats that like different people in the org will actually use. For example, a CEO is not going to look at your raw voice of customer data with your 300 quotes and all your notes. They're going to want to see things distilled down in a way that they can read in a few minutes. Yeah, you have anything to add to customer competitor research?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that I think of the different research methods there are for the copywriter, I don't think that there's any replacement for the customer interview. That is, I think, just one of the absolute best ways to really figure out who you're talking to, or who your copy is trying to convince. And developing the interviewing skill actually itself takes some time, because you have to learn how to sort of, you need to go in with your questions and your general idea of what you want to find out, but you also have to be kind of open to letting the conversation sort of take its own natural path. And all the while you have to be kind of stopping, or you let them talk, but whenever they are being a little bit too general, a little bit too vague, you have to kind of stop them and get them to be more specific. And I think that that's kind of the knack to customer interviews, is when, you say, what were you struggling with when you started looking for a company like this, this B2B SaaS company? And if they give you a kind of summary answer of, hey, we were struggling with, slow sales or whatever it is, you have to stop and go, okay, paint me a picture. What does that look like? What, did you have were there, you're trying to find out, was there a moment when they were having a meeting and someone said, if we don't speed up our sales cycles, we're going to be dead in the water in 9 months, or whatever it is. You're trying to get to that level of specificity. And I think that's ultimately the skill of customer interviews that makes it worth it.
And that specificity is the source of great copy. The copy that's longer than clients typically want, but is actually effective.
Yeah. Otherwise,
because episode.
Otherwise, every homepage headline for B2B SaaS would be, save money, make money, or save time.
Save time. Yeah, exactly.
There aren't that many different ways to phrase these things. And so that's where you're trying to get and crawl into that level of detail and specificity.
For sure. Yeah. Without getting too deep, I guess just to give people like an idea of how I would approach customer and competitor research, like super high level. I'm sure we're going to go deep on this in the future. For me, it's like 4 phases. So phase 1, I'm asking a client to send me anything they can send me that will help me understand their product, their category, and their ideal customers. Then I'm talking to people who are actually customer facing. So sales, success, support, product, on actually the kind of understanding, again, the product, the category, and their ideal customer from their perspective. I'm using this to inform like a jobs to be done style survey, which you should get familiar with the jobs to be done framework.
Absolutely.
There's lots of good books on it. I'm using those survey responses to inform interviews, because now I can actually ask follow-up questions and go deeper and kind of skip through some of the super high-level questions, because you have limited time when you're doing an interview. And then obviously, I guess step 5 would be actually analyzing and organizing all of that information. So that's kind of like how I approach it. I don't know if you have anything. You probably do something pretty similar.
Yeah, similar.
In an ideal world, anyways.
Yeah, in an ideal world. And
sometimes
the
survey doesn't always make sense. And
yeah, and the reality is you never have answers to all of the questions that you wish you could. I mean, I've never been sitting down knowing there's always something where I go, I wish I knew a little bit more about X or Y. That's the reality of it. I don't think anyone is ever going off of 100% data or anything like that.
No, definitely not. All right, number 5, I have positioning. So you do not need to be the April Dunford of positioning in order to have some understanding of it and be able to
just read her book.
Yeah, read her book. Honestly, it's amazing, and she does have another one in the works as well, which I'm sure is going to be equally amazing. Yeah, so definitely read her book. Obviously, awesome, April Dunford. You don't need to be an expert in this. You do not need to try to replace a consultant who spends all their time thinking about positioning. But what happens as a copywriter is you will get hired to write copy, and then you're going to find that the 2 pieces before copywriting are incomplete or missing altogether. And those 2 pieces are positioning, or the next thing that we're going to talk about, which I guess we can just include here, messaging strategy. Those 2 things inform copy. So being able to jump in and critique what they've done, add to it, edit it is super important if you want to be able to write copy that is actually going to be like consistent across the org, even after you leave as well, which is obviously key.
And just can I just add for anyone who because the terms positioning and messaging get thrown around a lot. And so
True.
the way that I like to sort of think of them is I think of positioning as like, who are you, what do you do, and who do you do it for? There's obviously a lot more that goes into it than that, and definitely go read Obviously Awesome, as we've told you to do already. And then messaging is more like, what are we going to talk about? What's important to our audience, and so that comes after positioning. So that's positioning is the highest level, most strategic part of this. Then messaging, what are we going to talk about? And then the copy is the actual expression of the messaging. So that's your actual execution. That's how you're going to say what your messaging strategy is. So yeah, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, because a lot of times people will use the term positioning when they really mean they're talking about just framing something a certain way, we want to position this as whatever, and they're just talking about copy. So just to be clear, positioning is its own discipline, and it's unbelievable how often you'll find companies asking you to write copy when the positioning really isn't figured out. And you can sort of suss those things out if you're talking to different people at the company, and you ask them what the product category is and who their target audience is. If you're getting different answers from different people in the company, or they don't have any clarity there, it's going to be hard to write copy without getting those things figured out first.
For sure. And if you don't get those things figured out and you just start writing copy, you're probably going to please one person, and then a bunch of other people are going to be like, really? This isn't what we're selling. This isn't who we're selling to. Why are you writing this copy? And so that's why you need to have that all in place. And I guess a cautionary thing that I would add here when we're talking about positioning is resist the urge to create a category. To me, that's that should be the last option when positioning just isn't going to work. I think too many people jump to this idea of creating a category simply because the work of trying to compete with the people in the market seems hard. And they're just like, well, we're just going to create this new thing that no one else is competing in, and then we'll win that category. And it's hard. We can talk about that another time, but really what you're trying to do is get people to care about and understand a completely new category in addition to selling your product. And that costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time. Do you agree with that, or are you in the create a category boot camp?
I mean, I've read and listened to positioning experts, sort of debate these things. But to be perfectly honest, I think that that's a little bit outside of the scope of what I do. I need to understand what they're doing, right? So if someone tells me, oh, we have a head-to-head positioning style or carve out, whatever it is, again, all stuff you can learn in April's book. I need to understand that, and I need to be able to ask questions to my client about it, and I need to be able to sense when it isn't rock solid or hasn't been figured out. But it's really not something that I include in my services to tell someone about whether or not they should be creating a category or competing head to head. I view that as something that is, for a positioning specialist.
Yeah, that's fair. Messaging strategy, I think we kind of lump that in with positioning. So unless you have something else you want to add to that, I think we kind of talked about it already.
I think we covered that.
This is another one that I think is maybe it's kind of related to the ability to sell, and that's graduating from a newbie freelancer who takes orders. So a client comes to you, they say, we need these 3 pages. You say, okay, it costs this much, to being someone who can actually diagnose and solve problems. So I know for me, this has drastically increased my average deal size compared to when I first started. And obviously the amount of value I'm delivering to clients. I don't know if you have anything that you want to cover on this, but for me, the main thing is that it just positions you as an expert once you're actually able to do this well, and increases average deal size. You're delivering more value, more likely to have them refer work to you and to want to work with you again, because you're no longer just this little piece that comes in and takes orders on the cheap.
Yeah, I mean, really, I think the skill we could call it is just like leadership. It's being able to see a path forward and recruit other people, whether that's your client or whoever, into that vision. And it doesn't mean that you're leading everything. You're still taking direction from the client in terms of, you have to understand their business and what they're doing and all of that. You're not just like coming in as the new chief marketing officer or something like that. Yeah. But you do want to be the person who says, okay, well, I have a process for how I deal with this. And, there's some flexibility within that process and some customization for you as the client. But ultimately, I'm here as a consultant as much as I am as a copywriter, a strategic consultant, not just a copywriter. And if you don't distinguish, if you don't put yourself into that, if you don't have prospects and clients seeing you that way as that expert consultant, and you are just kind of the hired hand, like that's not a pleasant way to make a living. And we all kind of have to do a little bit of working through that, especially if you don't know how to write copy when you're starting out as a freelancer. Like if you're still learning that at the same time, you're probably going to have to, maybe not, but you might have to do some projects where you feel like you're not the leader and you're not really in control. And for me, it was soul crushing to work that way, but I also recognized that there was something better on the other side. And so I was willing to go through that as a step to the other way. But to this day, if people start coming into a project where they sort of start acting like they know copy better than I do, or that they're the expert in this, it's not just about the money for me and that I can't charge as much if they don't see me as the expert. It's also just that like it crushes my sense of autonomy, and maybe my identity is like too wrapped up in this. But the fact of the matter is, like, it's very important to me that the client sees me as the strategic consultant and not someone who's just here to type or to write words.
Yeah. And you can tell that you're doing a good job of projecting this image by how those like leads come into your inbox. So when I first started, it was very much like, hey, we need 5 pages. This is what's going to go on the 5 pages. What do you charge? Whereas now it's more, they'll come to me with a problem. Like, hey, our product has changed fairly significantly. We've added to it. We've got this new product. We think we might be changing who we target with this new addition to our product. Like, what do you think we need to do? Like that's more common. Or I've even had some where they'll be like, hey, we have $25,000 to spend. How would you spend it? Like that's, Whoa. Yeah. So that cool. Did not happen in year 1 or 2. That's not how it went. It was very much like, do this for us because we don't have the time to do it.
Yeah.
Whereas
have you ever got?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I cut you off. You can take the guy out of New York. I guess. And now I lost my train of thought. Yeah, totally lost it.
Oh, you're gonna say, have you ever had?
Oh yeah, when someone sends you like an email or they fill out your intake form and it's like, they're almost like bossing you. They're like, you will do this. And it's like a list of like all of these like detailed requirements. And you're like,
I've had that.
Oh, I'm not.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've definitely had that before. And yeah, I often don't even respond to those types anymore because I just know there's no way that I'm going to turn that into a good project. No. But in year 1, I would have taken it for sure. Why not?
Oh,
You got to,
yeah. I
you got
mean,
to get the money.
yeah, and there's so much just going through it. And I also feel like, we've covered, do we have any skills left to cover? Or have we, oh yeah, we do. We have a couple.
I have one more list. Well, like one and a half. Yeah, listed.
Okay, cool. So I'll hold my my thoughts until we finish that. I'll probably forget.
Yeah, and I will say though that I do still sometimes take on a project where, because it's a tighter timeline and they do have a fixed budget and they're like, hey, we've got this launch coming up. It's in a month. We need 8 emails. What's it going to cost us to have you write these emails? And I'll do that sometimes, just as long as I'm transparent about the idea that, I'm not going to be able on this timeline and with this scope, I'm not going to be able to inform your strategy. You guys are going to put that together and I'm going to execute. And those can still be and sometimes even more like per unit of like effort and time, like even more lucrative on occasion, as long as you're not giving them a huge price break, because you're not doing all that strategic work. Because that strategic work, as you know, like you can go down rabbit holes and dead ends, and it is time intensive.
Yeah, having that time capped, I think, is having that work based on a short timeline and tying it to that timeline is a good way to deal with that. And that's how, I mean, some people make a killing only selling day rates,
Yep. That's a whole nother episode. I've never done it before. I know you've experimented with it, but yeah, I've definitely seen people do well. My last, I guess, main one is knowing how to do like lo-fi wireframe. So not necessarily being a designer or replacing a designer, but being able to put something together there.
Absolutely.
I use Balsamic. You use?
I use Figma.
Figma's
going to have a longer learning curve. If anyone is looking at Balsamic, if you're just starting out, Balsamic's probably faster. Figma takes a little bit of time, but once you start to learn some of the tricks it has, it ends up being a pretty powerful tool. But yeah, same here. Like I am by no means a graphic designer. It's not something that comes naturally to me at all. But the reason that I bothered to learn how to create lo-fi wireframes are for a few reasons. So the practical reason is that it creates like a bridge between copy and design. So if you just hand a Google document over to a designer, they might not have the same vision for that you have about what that should be like. And as someone who identifies as a conversion copywriter, everything I do is focused on getting that conversion, getting that business result. And some designers might not have the same mindset. Like they might be thinking, I want to make this as visually impressive as possible. And that sometimes can be counterproductive for your goal, which is to get the conversion. So a wireframe is essentially you're learning how to, or what you're doing is you're just laying out the page and just showing someone else, like, here's how it's supposed to flow, taking it one step past just words and a little bit closer to design. In like, I'm not using colors. Everything is white, gray, dark gray, or black.
Me too.
And lo-fi, just low fidelity. You're not creating something that looks like a designer made it necessarily. But the other reason that you want to do it from a more, I guess, like selfish point of view is that you can charge more. And if you get really good at wireframing, if you get fast at it, the way like I'm starting to get really fast with Figma, it's a way to make your deliverables worth a lot more. And it sends a signal kind of that it looks like more. It's like sometimes people think like, copy, words, there's some sort of block about paying a lot of money for words.
Yeah.
But when it's in this thing that's sort of like it's words plus design now, it becomes more valuable and it also just looks more valuable. And then from a design perspective, you should also be able to review whatever it is that the designer has created and be able to spot any things that might be getting in the way of conversions. So again, you don't have to be a graphic designer. You don't have to take like all these courses or things like that, but you should know the basics of design. And, at this point I can spot things like, okay, the way the designer did this is like, this button that's really important is really buried and like hard to see here. And, maybe it needs to be a higher contrast color and a bigger button, and maybe we need an arrow there. So being able to understand how the design affects the parts of it that you own, which should be in part the performance of the page or whatever, or email, whatever it is, you should be able to give constructive feedback on that. That's not to say that you're not going around pushing pixels or how to drop shot, whatever. Like, you're not trying to replace anyone's job. You're not trying to become a designer, but you have to be able to see how the design is going to impact performance and give feedback on that.
For sure. And the one way that I phrase it when I'm, writing a proposal or having a sales conversation is by delivering it in this lo-fi wireframe, I'm speeding up that whole design and development process. And what I think this does is, in the client's mind, it allows them to think like, okay, I can borrow a little bit from what I was going to pay design and allocate it here, since we're going to be saving some time. And so it does allow you to add some value, because they're going to need fewer design resources in order to execute on this. So yeah, my wireframes, despite using Balsamiq, very similar, black and white, no images. I always make sure to tell them that this is not meant to replace a designer. I'm not going to be making your typography decisions. And if you have a good designer and they see what I've done and they want to make some changes, I tell them to trust their designer to do their job. But ultimately, the pages end up looking a lot more like I envisioned versus if I were to just give them a Google Doc and tell them to run wild with it. And I guess the last piece there, and this goes back to client management, when you submit a wireframe with comments in the margins that describe, some of the key decisions that you've made, and you deliver it in a PDF, you're going to get a far fewer revisions versus that Google Doc with everyone able to comment and make suggested edits. So super important. So for me, that was the end of my list of like the things that are super valuable now. The one thing that I could see becoming more valuable is something that I've called in other places called like moonshot messaging, which is this idea that as categories become more crowded, which they are in B2B SaaS almost across the board, and as more companies and marketing teams and freelancers catch on to this idea of using the voice of your customer in your copy, that might not be enough anymore to stand out and be memorable. And so this idea of moonshot messaging is that you might need to take chances with your messaging, capture the essence of what your customers are saying, but do it in a way that is, maybe jarring or shocking, unexpected, memorable, sticky. So like for me, a recent example is Coda and their "enough of this" sheet tagline, rather than, obviously what they're alluding to. And you can't forget it. It got shared like crazy. And as soon as you come across it, whether you're going to be a Coda customer or not, when it comes time to think about those types of tools, so Notion, Coda, etc., they're going to be in your consideration set because you will not forget them. And I think that's going to become increasingly important in the coming years.
Awesome.
Yeah. Anything you want to add? Anything else that you think copywriters?
Just one last thing that I don't think I touched on, but like one thing is, especially if you're positioning yourself as a conversion copywriter, that you should have a basic understanding of like analytics and statistics. So again, don't have to go take a statistics course or anything like that, but like you should know what things mean. Like you should know what it means if someone's like, someone runs an A/B test and they say like, okay, like, this beat the control, but it wasn't statistically significant. Like you should know what that means. And that doesn't, again, not taking a course, you don't have to sign up for like go to your local college, university for a stats class, anything like that. But you do have to understand like, okay, what, like when people run an A/B test, what does the outcome mean? When one page beats the other, do you know that's a trustworthy result or a statistically significant result or not? You should just know those basic things. And conversion rate, like very basic stuff, doesn't take a long time to learn, but you have to be able to speak to it and understand what it means if you're, especially if you have clients who are running tests and things like that. You should just have a basic sense, be able to participate in the conversation, basically.
Yeah, and I guess even having enough knowledge to talk people down from doing tests. It's a reflex for a lot of people to be like, yeah, we want to figure out, a better way of doing this homepage, so we're going to do an A/B test, and then you find out, so you have 1,000 people visiting your site each month and about 40 conversions a month. So are we going to run this test for like 2 years, or like the whole
Right.
world
You're
will
going
have
to
changed
change.
in 2 years? Yeah.
Yeah. And
So,
that kind of stuff is hard to, it's kind of hard to learn. But one thing you could do is like, you can just open up, you just look at what is it? Like an A/B test calculator, I guess it's
oh
called.
yeah, there's plenty.
And just like, if you just play around with it, you'll sort of start to get a sense of like what makes sense. And so you'll see that it's like, and just as a side note, like usually a test is feasible if you can run it like within about a month.
Yeah.
And if you don't have enough traffic, or enough conversions, or enough of a difference between between what you're testing, you're not going to be able to do that. And so, yeah, 100%. I have clients all the time like that, where it's like, oh, we'll just test it. And then you look and it's like something like what you described, and it's going to take a long time. Or if it's shorter, it's, you're just not going to get a reliable result. So A/B testing, I think when I started conversion copywriting, I was assuming that every SaaS company with a website was running A/B tests all the time. It's just not the case.
No,
The more
I'll
advanced
actually,
ones
yeah,
are, but with a lot of traffic, but plenty of them are doing no such thing.
full confession, there's very little A/B testing, in my experience, and that's even with some really good clients that have the traffic. And the reason for that is they just don't want to invest in multiple versions, or what they're doing is the pages that we're working on are 3 years old, and there's just so much that has changed. It does not make sense to just test some small difference versus it, because we need an overhaul at that point. A lot has
Just
changed.
blow it up and write a new one.
Yeah. And then in the future, they might do some small tests like internally with their marketing team, like let's change the headline or whatever it is they want to do. So yeah, A/B tests, knowing when to do them, knowing how to do them, understanding like how to manipulate all the different variables that will help you get to statistical significance. Like if you're low traffic, low conversion, you have to go for a much bigger lift in order to see that statistical significance. In order to do that, you're probably going to have to change a lot about the page. And then the trade-off there is that even if you win, you won't know why necessarily, because you changed so much.
Right.
Yeah, just you don't need to know like p-values and all the different tests and stuff like that off the top of your head, but like you should kind of understand how the pieces all work together and the trade-offs that you make. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess under that same category would be like watching user sessions using something like Hotjar or Full Story. That's kind of like analytics, but knowing how to actually go in there, focus in on the right sessions and pull some of the insights out. Like I often find, I don't know, what's your experience with watching sessions? Like, do you find them super useful these days?
Not usually. So if someone has Full Story or something like that, I will go through and watch a handful. And sometimes I'll play around with like the journey a little bit. So I'll be like, all right, so for people who do convert, like, what does that look like? Are they clicking around to all these different pages? Is it a fairly quick thing or not? But I think if I'm being perfectly honest, like, we've talked about some other things like wireframing, or in the case of like analytics, where we're trying to figure out information that's going to inform what we're creating, like customer interviews and things like that. Like if I have to choose between watching recorded sales calls and watching recordings of people use the website, every single time I'm going to take the recorded sales calls.
Me too.
So I don't want to create the impression that like learning how to use some of these fancy analytics tools, whatever it is, Hotjar, Full Story, that is like a crucial or core part of being a copywriter. I guarantee you there are successful B2B SaaS copywriters who have never opened Hotjar or have never opened Full Story and still do a bang up job every time. So I don't want to mislead people into thinking that it's like super important, at least not to my process. There are plenty of projects where I don't use any screen recordings, things like that. Heat maps I find a little bit more useful on longer pages, because you can see if there's a certain spot where you're losing everyone. But I think that those tools those skills rather should probably take a little bit of a backseat to things like like the table stakes skills we talked about, and then like wireframing, client management, those kinds of things.
100%. Yeah, I agree. All right. So I guess to wrap it up, maybe a quick summary. Number one, table stakes, copywriting, psychology. Number 2, business acumen. So sales, client management, industry knowledge, tons packed into there. I'm sure we'll talk about that again at a more granular level. Number 3, what you get from repetitions and specialization, which is being able to spot patterns. So David Baker is a great person to look to learn more about that. Customer and competitor research. Jen Havice's book, Finding the Right Message, is great. And actually, the person who asked the question today, ekaterinahoward.com, would be a good place to go as well. I've hired her before, and she's actually quite good at customer research. Yeah, she is good. Adrian Barnes has used her as well, so she knows what she's doing. To be honest, I hardly even had to talk to her. She just did it, and it was great. So yeah, she's really good at what she does. Positioning. That's April Dunford. I don't think there's really many other people even on that level.
There are other people out there, but April's the best starting point to start.
Yeah, she's great. Messaging strategy. I don't think we had a resource necessarily to point anyone towards, but
if you start with April Dunford's book, I think
that's
because
true.
Positioning always bleeds into messaging strategy the same way that messaging strategy always bleeds into copy.
True. Yeah, I would actually, if you combine April Dunford's book and Jen Havice's book, you'll have a pretty good framework right there. And then maybe finish it off with some copy hackers for copywriting. That's kind of like my trio.
Good trio.
Yeah. So messaging strategy. Number 7, being able to diagnose and solve problems versus just taking orders. You'll be able to increase your average deal size while also adding more value to your clients. Being able to lo-fi wireframe, so not just delivering your stuff in a Google Doc. And if you do a YouTube search for Joel Kletke Balsamic, he actually gave like a free little workshop on there, which is super useful. It's probably like 5 years old now, but it's honestly still relevant. You mentioned analytics, which is definitely important. Just the basics. You don't need to be a statistician to use it. And in the future, as categories become more competitive and people catch on to what it is we do as copywriters, I think this idea of moonshot messaging or coming up with ways of saying what your customers are saying in a way that's more memorable and shocking and jarring will become increasingly important to as a way to stand out. Sound good?
Awesome.
All right, let's end it there.